Good morning, everyone. I'm Susan Hovanek, the Member Engagement Specialist with the Pittsburgh Airport Area Chamber of Commerce. And we just want to thank you to our viewers for joining us this morning for today's tips from the experts, cyber resilience for small businesses. So join me in welcoming our speakers. Today we have Dan Munchak from Opticom Consulting. Dan has been working in telecom and technology since 1986. Starting with the telecommunications and networking group at Carnegie Mellon University. He managed application development at American Management Systems in the early 90s and was executive director at Verizon IT in the late 90s. And in 2003, he co-founded Opticom Consulting. Also joining us is Tracy Fox, who has been part of the technology industry since 1983, starting her career with Apple in the education market and then moving into the commercial consulting sector in the 1990s. Tracy has been with Foresite for 12 years and currently serves as their national channel director. We've got two very experienced people with us today who are working together who help small businesses. So thank you for being with us today, Dan and Tracy, as you share your expertise and tell us how small to medium-sized organizations can make their businesses more resilient to cybercrime while they protect themselves against us. So let's take it away, Dan and Tracy. Tracy?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you. Great.
Oh, okay.
Okay, great.
Hey, Susan, yeah, you've stopped my video, so.
Ooh, I'll get you going. Here we go. Sorry. That's the power of Oz, I always say.
There we go. All right. All right, just real quick, before we get started, I just wanted to mention that we have a pretty tight schedule for the presentation today. So if you have a question for Tracy or me, please just send them to us and we'll use using the chat feature and we'll answer them at the end. It looks like Tracy's still muted too, her video. Anyway, we already did a little bit of this presentation. I'm Dan Munchak, Vice President of Opticom Consulting. I've been in technology for 35 years. I had to do the math. Starting with, I think we talked about the networking telecom group at CMU, then doing application development at AMS, and then with Verizon IT before I co-founded Opticom Consulting in 2003. So to discuss cyber resilience today, I've invited a partner with Tracy Fox from Foresite. Tracy?
Good morning. Great to see everybody this morning. I've been in technology longer than I care to admit, but my specialty is understanding what the concerns are for businesses and helping to find the right services to address those concerns. So excited to see what questions people have today.
Great. You want to click to the next slide? Yeah, there we go. All right. I just want to talk a little bit about Opticom now that we've been introduced. As I mentioned, we were founded in 2003 in Pittsburgh as a technology consulting company, and we're focused on the telecom and technology needs of our business and nonprofit clients. One issue that has always been extremely relevant to clients is cybersecurity, and it's been our mission to help our clients navigate this thorny issue. You can go to the next slide, Tracy. Now I want to talk a little bit about today's agenda. So as you can see, first, we're going to talk about cyber resilience and why it's more than just security, but an approach to managing risk. Next, we're going to talk about the threat. It used to be mostly the big guys. Enterprises were always the big targets, but today the bad actors are mostly organized crime, and they have an industrial approach to cybercrime. You can't assume anymore that just because you're small, you're going to be safe. Next, we're going to talk about, demonstrate the types of threats you're facing by talking about some real-world examples that we've encountered. Then we'll talk about 5 questions you can ask yourself to help you decide how resilient your organization is. And then finally, we'll talk about a breach response package and how it can help fill in the gaps and help you respond to a breach. Then we can have some time for some Q&A and answer your questions from the chat. All right, to talk about cyber resilience, I want to talk about cybersecurity, not just protecting your organization, but as a process for helping your organization managing risk. dealing with and containing threats and still operating as normal. Cyber resilience is not just protection. It's based on a framework, which we'll talk about in a minute, for helping you manage incidents and recover from incidents. Then cybersecurity is on everyone's mind these days for good reason. It's very important to protect your organization against the threats you're facing, but a complete framework approach helps you when you actually have a breach, not just protection, but actually responding to when you actually have a breach. And then we're going to end the day with 5 key questions to ask yourself. And then we'll talk about a free report that we're offering to all attendees. There we go. All right, now the cyber framework. The framework we use to describe cyber resilience was developed by the National Institute for Standards and Technology, and it has 5 steps: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. It's laid out in a circle this way to indicate that this is a process of continuous improvement. Okay, so identify is doing a complete inventory of the business assets you need to protect and also deciding what risks they represent. Now, this can be, are they just operational information, or are you keeping PII or PHI, which is personal identifiable information or personal health information that would really damage your organization if it got out? Protect is what most people think about when they discuss cybersecurity. Protect is managing firewalls, locking down network switches, protecting Wi-Fi, and setting up antivirus protection on PCs. These are things trying to keep the bad guys out. Detect, I like to quote from Robert Mueller, the former director of the FBI, when he says that there are now only 2 types of companies left in the United States: those that have been hacked and those that don't know they've been hacked. Detect is setting yourself up to know when you've been compromised. If the bad guys do get in, you don't want to give them any time to do a lot of damage. Tracy's going to talk about how badly companies fail at this in just a few minutes. Then we have respond. Even organizations that monitor their systems carefully often do not have the resources to see validation of results and validation of alerts and then responding to them, especially for incidents that require forensics for people to dig into what happened and then kick the bad guys out again. And then finally, recovery is kind of the most overlooked step. What lessons have we learned that we can improve protecting assets in our future? How do we prevent this from happening again? How do we recover lost productivity and lost reputation? That's really in a sense, the thing that we've done. Now that I've covered that basic framework, Tracy's going to talk about why it's so important.
Thanks, Dan. So part of the issue is the sheer volume of threats. Hackers are attacking. It's all automated now. So they don't have to be targeting a particular business. They have these attacks that they can buy on the dark web. They can buy lists of emails. So they can say, I want to attack manufacturers in Pennsylvania. I want to attack attorneys on the East Coast or healthcare in California. They can get that specific and buy all of that information right on the dark web. So in 2020, the attacks were happening roughly every 39 seconds. The statistics are projected to go to about every 11 seconds in 2021. So think about that. We're hearing about so many attacks already, seeing it, but it's going to triple this year. That's the expectation. A big part of the problem is that over half of the threats go undetected. So we see this a lot if we're called in to do an assessment for a business, we're helping them to align to a cyber framework, and we often find indications that there's already ransomware in their network and sometimes even unauthorized access. We had a financial group where we went in to do our assessment and we found that they had unauthorized access from both China and Russia into their network, and they had no idea. And even when threats are detected, the time to detect on average in 2019 was 206 days. I'm going to show you some 2020 stats, and it didn't really get any better. And then the other aspect of recover, of course, is the cost. What happens when this data is breached? A $90 per record cost is the low end. That's data that's just protected information. So even publicly available information like people's emails, their title, their phone number, their address, even if that information could be found on the internet, it's not protected per se. If you are collecting this through your website, there is an expectation that by requesting it and storing it, that you're also protecting it. So we'll talk about what that might mean, because that's the low end of the $90 per record. So even if you have 1,000 records, $90,000 right off the bat if that data is exposed. And if you have any health data, that's going to be the higher end. $345 per record is for health information. The reason that's even more valuable is there's usually enough data within health information that somebody can buy it on the dark web and they can set up fake credit accounts. So if they steal my credit card number, chances are I'm going to see fake charges on my bill and I'm going to cancel my card relatively soon, usually within 30 to 60 days. But if they get enough of my health data that they can impersonate me and open a new account that I know nothing about and have those bills sent to their email or their address or PO box somewhere, how long will it be before I see something like that on my credit report and can then find a way to cancel it? And that's why that health data is so much more valuable even than credit card data. And insurance doesn't always pay. We'll touch on that a little bit more too. So one of the things that's really critical to understand is ransomware is not new, but it's the #1 threat for businesses. And it's also gotten a lot more serious. What used to happen is you'd click on an email, you'd get a virus that was ransomware, it would encrypt your files, and the attackers would ask for $5,000. That was the most common ransom at the very beginning, sometimes 10. And if you had a really good backup, you could simply restore from your backup or have your IT provider like Dan do that. And that was it. You'd go on with your day. It was an inconvenience, but it didn't destroy your business. But what the hackers are doing now is they are not just encrypting your data in most cases, they're also taking a copy of it. And when they do that, they can come to you and demand the ransom. But if you've got a really good backup, there's two tricky things they do. One is they've evolved the ransomware. So often it will wait until someone starts a backup restore, and then it will corrupt that backup. So now you can't use it. And now the only way potentially that you might get your data back, unless you have another copy, is to pay them. But the other thing they'll do, if you do have a way of getting your data back, or you just plain refuse to negotiate with them, you don't want to pay the ransom, they will threaten to release the information if you don't pay them. So they've moved from ransom to full out extortion. And there've been a number of cases of this. The worst part is there's no honor among thieves, because there's nothing to say that even if you do pay them, that they won't put the information out for sale in the dark web. Because remember, their motivation is they want to get as much money from this data as possible. So if they can get money from you and get money from selling it on the dark web, that's usually what they do. Eventually, the data that goes on the dark web may also get exposed, even if you paid the ransom or even if you paid their extortion demands. And so this chart is showing these are in millions of dollars, some of the amounts now that they're asking. It's not uncommon. There was a recent law firm, the initial ransom demand was $21 million. And when the firm wouldn't pay it, they doubled it, and then they exposed the data on the dark web. So the real key thing here to know, yeah.
I was just going to say, since you mentioned law firms, do you want to mention why law firms are now sort of a primary target of ransomware?
Oh, sure. Yeah, they're a primary target because two real reasons. The data they hold is very sensitive, which makes it valuable, but also because they haven't fallen under any regulatory requirements specific to law firms on protecting data, they don't usually have the full cybersecurity framework, all those different layers of protection that Dan just reviewed. And so that makes them easy targets. And it's also recently been reported that China actually has a wish list of types of data that they want, and they make it available on the dark web to hackers so that hackers can go and try to find specific intellectual property information or information about specific people. And if they can figure out who their law firm is, then that's another way of targeting that information. So it's truly a big business. It's nation state sponsored in many cases. And since once data is exposed, you can't unring that bell. The key is preventing it as best you possibly can. And when we talked about detection, those stats, the 206 days, that was from 2019. This report came out in June of 2020. When I first heard that it took on average over 6 months to detect an incident, my assumption was that was probably a lot of industries that didn't have requirements. So people like law firms where they don't have a specific requirement to monitor their network. In fact, that's not the case. When you look at the number one here, with 287 days average, entertainment, a lot of what falls under entertainment would be people that take credit cards, and they're required to monitor their credit card environment 24/7. Healthcare number two at 255 days also falls under HIPAA, and they've been required to monitor 24/7 for what, Dan, 5 or 6 years now,
Yeah.
I think?
Or longer, yeah.
So it's not that people don't know that they should be doing it. They're not always doing it, but they're also not always doing it effectively. And that's a big part of the problem. Knowing what you should be monitoring, having people who are actually watching it 24/7. These hackers are smart, and they know in the US that a lot of organizations wouldn't have full-time IT that's covering Saturdays and Sundays or holidays or 2 in the morning. And so that's often when they choose to strike. But the other aspect of how long they're in your network is that's what helps them to steal all this data. So if they're in there undetected for over 6 months, they can hunt around, they can find all of the sensitive information that might be scattered through the network. They've got plenty of time to make copies of it, do whatever it is they want to do, put their keylogger information in so they can install that undetected. They can start collecting whatever you or your staff is typing. Think about the danger of that. And so all of this damage is being done and you don't even know they're there.
Yeah, that's typically what we talk about when we talk about the kill chain, that the longer you give somebody in there, what they do is they look for other places they can escalate their privileges, other data that they didn't even know you had. So you just don't want to give them very long to sniff around in your network.
Definitely not. And so these are some questions that we put together to help you think about what are the things that you need to consider when you're thinking about the level of risk that you might have. And these are just some of the key questions. Does your organization have cloud access or third-party access that may not be adequately secured? Now, what does that mean? So when you put data in the cloud, whether it's in something like a file sharing software or a cloud Office 365 instance, you still are responsible for that data. And that's a misconception that a lot of organizations have is, I'm going to put it in the cloud so I don't have to worry about protecting it. But although you can often pay for additional protections in the cloud, and it's still maybe less costly than trying to put all those controls in place on your physical network, ultimately you still have a responsibility for that data regardless of where it's stored if you collected it, if you own it. And so there was a file transfer system that was corrupted recently, file sharing software that's been corrupted. And once that gets breached, the owner of the software is responsible for notifying you, but then you would still be responsible for notifying any affected parties of the data that you had put into that service. So it would still constitute a breach of your data, even if it was stored somewhere else. So lessons to learn there. Third-party access might be somebody like your accountant. You might give them access to come in and pull data out of your accounting system, maybe once a month or once a week. You might have web developers that have access into your network, or consultants that work for you that have access to your network. So you want to make sure that they're taking the proper security precautions, and that you have a record that you've asked about that and that they've assured you that they are protecting the data. So if something happens, at least you can go back and show that you did your due diligence.
Well, I just wanted to make one mention. Third-party access is actually a big reason that a lot of small businesses are now being forced to adopt new protections, because let's say you have third-party access to healthcare facilities or something like that. You're an accountant, you're a law firm or whatever, and you have access into their network. Well, they're now reaching out because they're subject to these regulations. They're now reaching out to their people who have third-party access to their networks, recognizing that they're a big target. And speaking of Target, that's how people got into the Target breach. It was through their HVAC provider. So now people are becoming more aware of that, and larger companies, enterprise companies, are now reaching out to all the small companies that service them and saying, now you have to meet the same criteria that we do, or at least some level of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the craziest one I ever heard was an agency that was doing some really confidential work for the US government. And so they were being directly targeted by the hackers. This isn't a normal scenario for a typical SMB, but the attackers were doing a physical surveillance of this company to try and find their way in. And they realized that the physical security was really strong, but something they did see was the same Chinese food delivery that was going there every couple of days at lunchtime. And so they went in and they managed to hack the Chinese food website where they were placing their online orders. And they got keylogger software into this agency through the website that they ordered their lunch. So that's the craziest one I've heard, but those are the kinds of things. You wouldn't think that your lunch provider would be an issue for your cybersecurity, but in a targeted situation like that, even that's possible. But again, the number one threat, ransomware. And so how cyber savvy is your staff? Are you giving people training? Are you doing it only when they get hired? Do you refresh it once a year? Do you give them ongoing training? Because that's the best way to make sure they're aware of the most recent threats. So things like the things that come into your email saying you've been exposed to someone who's tested positive for COVID, click here for instructions. That's a new one that's come up recently, or since this whole pandemic. So make sure that they know maybe what they saw in the training a year ago isn't what they're going to get in their email today, but make sure they're armed to resist, because they often are your weakest link. And another way of doing that is doing ongoing phishing emails, where you create a fake email using this service, not you personally, but something that we can help you with, is putting together a fake email, sending it out, and seeing how many people click on this. Because we have times where we test organizations, maybe a third of their staff click on it. Half of those people give us their credentials. And sometimes the failure rate's even higher. We've had times in healthcare organizations where we've had over 60% failure rate. So they not only click on this, where if we were truly malicious people, we would have gotten ransomware in there. But if we can get them to give us their login and password, if we trick them into that, now we can get on the network and potentially go completely undetected because we have authorized access. And so those are things that can be watched for, but if no one's watching, they'll be in. Mm-hmm. And so that goes to, how do you monitor to detect and validate threats? And is this happening 24/7? So even in the scenario where someone gets credentials, let's say I trick your secretary into giving me her credentials and she has access to sensitive data on the network and she doesn't realize that she gave them up. If you have the right monitoring in place and the right settings, then if I do try to get in, it's going to detect potentially that there's a second attempted login when someone's already logged in. Or if I'm in China or Russia, I should be able to try and log in. Maybe the geo-blocking is preventing that. Or if there's multi-factor authentication in place, having the login and password isn't enough because it's going to send a text, or it's going to require me to read off a token, so that it's not only something you know with the login and password, it's also something that you have, where it would require someone to get a hold of my cell phone as well as my credentials. So those are all ways that you can try and prevent that from happening. But if something unusual is detected, do you also have someone to validate? What does this mean? is there something that is truly a concern? Now, this also flows into credentials. Are those credentials, those logins and passwords, already for sale out on the dark web? Well, how could that happen? Maybe you've been breached without detecting it, so that's one way. Or that information was available to a third party that you use and they were breached, and so it's exposed that way. Or in a lot of cases, the most common thing is that staff reuses credentials. So people might have signed in with their work email and used the same password that they used to get into your network for some business-related website that they went to, and then that was exposed through a breach. So it's always good to know if there are credentials or other data that's attributed to your domain out in the dark web so that you can help protect from that.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a common trick that people, when let's say Adobe gets breached, they get breached like every other month, and you use whatever login and password, the hackers go out and they try that login and password on anything that might be related to you. And so let's say you used it on Amazon, they'll get into your Amazon account, but also if you're using those same passwords on your business network, then they'll try that too. And that's how I get into a lot of things.
Right. And even if the password got changed, then the password crackers are often effective. If they know half of the secret code by knowing your login, there's nothing to say that they can't just keep hammering with a password cracker, especially if there's no detection in place to see the failed attempt. And that's something that when we're monitoring, we're always watching for, because password crackers have gotten extremely, extremely effective, even with strong passwords, which also goes back to that whole idea of multi-factor authentication being key. And then the last piece is, does your insurance policy have language that can invalidate a claim and what isn't covered? So I'll give you a little bit more background on this. The most common thing that small businesses and medium businesses do is they get a cyber insurance rider on their commercial insurance policy, and they rely on that to be the cavalry if something happens. They're going to help me. I won't have to worry about it. I'll just call my agent and they're going to take care of it for me. And that's typically not the case, because my understanding from my contacts in the cyber insurance world is that a cyber insurance rider, an average one, nets that agent $40 or $100 a year. So it doesn't make sense for them to spend a ton of time doing research and trying to align the policy to your actual risk. They just look for a rider that they can bolt on so that you have some coverage. Now, the other problem with that is most of the time, the cyber insurance company does not have forensics resources available for you. So if you're relying on that, you contact them and you say, I've been breached and I need help. The most common answer you'll get is, okay, we'll open a claim for you, no problem. You'll need to go out and find someone to help you with this investigation and help you to get the hackers out of your network. But, oh, by the way, you've got a $50,000 deductible. So now you're going to be out of pocket up to that $50,000. And a typical reactive breach response starts around $30,000 to $60,000. So you'll definitely be spending that almost no matter what. But even if your insurer does have that coverage in place, those riders, the generic riders, often include language like failure to maintain. So if there's language that says that they don't have to pay your claim if you fail to maintain your network, what does that mean? Or fail to take reasonable controls to protect the data, what does that mean? You don't want things like that that are completely open to interpretation. And another one that we've been seeing in 2021 is if on your insurance application, they said, are you compliant with HIPAA, for example, or PCI compliance if you have credit card data? Or even if they say, are you meeting all data privacy regulations or laws? And you just generically say yes, that is almost a trick question, because nobody could definitively say yes at all times, because these things change and evolve. And even if a new law comes out and you find out about it, now you might have to change something in your network to comply with it. and you can't do that instantly. And so you don't want to leave them those outs to be able to deny a claim. This is really critical. So when you get your insurance renewal or any type of questionnaire for new coverage, if they are asking, are you compliant with or are you meeting, do not just give a blanket yes. The right way to answer those questions are things like, as of January 2nd, when we had a third party review our network, we were meeting the current requirements for HIPAA or PCR, et cetera. So I know that's a lot to think about, but when you think that you've got $2 or $3 million of protection, you don't want to have that claim invalidated and find out you don't. And I'm going to show you some real scenarios here that have happened. I can't name names because these are actual cases that we've been involved in. So the first one was exactly that cyber insurance scenario. And the reason that the insurance companies are really getting stringent about claims is because they didn't understand the cyber risk when they started selling these policies. Cyber insurance has really only been around for 3 years, 5 years for the real leading edge insurers, and they didn't have any historical data to know what is their risk and what sector is the biggest risk. And so that's why now that they're having losses and they're getting hit with 400 times the claims that they had 2 years ago, and these are real numbers, they're trying to find a way out of paying. And so another tricky thing that they'll do is in your policy, it might say that you have to notify them within 48 hours of an incident. So you better be able to detect it, and then you better know that you need to notify them within 48 hours. And we had a client, more than one, unfortunately, that were breached and didn't immediately know what to do as part of incident response and didn't know that they needed to notify their insurer within 48 hours. One was denied $2 million in coverage. Another scenario is the Federal Trade Commission is responsible for protecting the data of U.S. consumers. And so even without a breach, if you are collecting marketing data through your website, so somebody wants to download something and you get their email and their name, their company name, maybe their position. Again, this doesn't have to be secretive information, doesn't have to be health data, it doesn't have to be credit card data, but you're collecting that data. And so the Federal Trade Commission says that you need to take, again, quote unquote, reasonable steps to protect it. And we have had now over a dozen different companies that have come to us after the fact where they did not have a breach, but the Federal Trade Commission can just show up and say, you collected this data, show us how you're protecting it. And every time the fines were in the 6 figures, and these are not big companies, roughly 40 person is the largest. And then cyber extortion, this one law firm in California that I talked about with the $21 million demand that was raised to $42 million, they still refused to pay. The FBI told them not to. That data was exposed and sold on the dark web. And so all of their customers, they had Madonna and Usher and Bruce Springsteen, and it was a very embarrassing public data exfiltration, but there are a lot of examples that haven't made the news as well. So let's say that you detect a potential incident. These are the steps that you need to go through. You need to be able to validate if the data is a threat. You need to know if you have logging that you can go back through for an understanding of what's happening in your network. You need to have sources of threat intelligence because you might need to orient what you're seeing to what the current cyber threats are. And did you really have exposure? There was an incident with a cybersecurity solution called SolarWinds. It made the news. It's used by the US government and a lot of enterprise businesses. And so we had a lot of clients who used that solution. We were able to help them orient what we were seeing in their logs versus what showed that someone had actually been breached. And it was really the US government and a handful of others so far that were actually breached before the patch came out. And then how do you decide on tactics to address a threat who's involved in those decisions and who needs to be involved. What requirements do you need to meet? For example, the insurance notification requirements, but also if you have data on citizens of Europe or California, there's a 72-hour notification requirement where they can fine you if you don't. And that's why ACT needs to follow those other steps, because if you take the wrong action or you take steps out of order, you might end up with those scenarios that get even worse, where your backup gets put in and then that gets corrupted, or the chain of custody for any evidence that's there gets corrupted and you can't pursue legal action, or your insurance claim gets rejected. And so there are a lot of those cases where you might need help outside of your own team or your regular IT provider. And so what we have offered through Dan is a breach response service. And what it includes is 24/7 access to breach response resources that can help you to know what are you required to do. We can start investigations right away. If your commercial insurance does not provide investigative services, then that comes out of this service. And there's $250,000 of coverage with no deductible. So instead of getting the bad news of, hey, you need to find your own resources, and by the way, the first $50,000 comes out of your pocket, no problem, you can use this service and get that money paid. And even if your commercial insurer does provide the investigation and they might require that you use their service for that, you can still call on this coverage to pay for your deductible and also pay for common exclusions, such as regulatory fines like the FTC fine. If they find you $100,000, usually your commercial insurance won't pay for that. So this just gives you that protection. I always tell SMBs in particular, don't spend a lot of time and money on an incident response plan and trying to come up with every scenario for a playbook. If this isn't what you do all the time, chances are you'll make a misstep. The best thing to do is to have resources that you can get hold of 24/7 should you need them. And to that service, Dan can also get you pricing for having that ongoing online cybersecurity awareness training and those ongoing phishing test campaigns. So we can make sure that your staff stays trained up and that we're testing to make sure that they recognize when those types of emails come in and try to protect you from that number one threat. And when you do that effectively, now instead of being your weakest link, they can become a powerful asset and a piece of your cybersecurity protection.
I think too, and you're mentioning the biggest, the weakest link in any protection is really the people who are there, because it's just trying to stay on top of all these different issues and things like that. So having this continuous training, but also, and I think down at the bottom, we talked a little bit about policies and procedures, and that's another one that that helps you manage employees, because if you can set the expectations with employees to say, here are the things we're expecting you. Like, for example, if somebody shows up at the workspace and they're not being accompanied, right? Do you have a policy that your employees need to? It gives them the permission to then go and say, hey, you know, where are you heading? Can I help you get there? And those kinds of things to watch out for those kinds of things. So it's not just, you know, being aware of cybersecurity threats. It's also being aware of physical threats and those kinds of things, and having people aware of what their responsibilities are or what they're allowed to do in those kinds of situations.
Yeah, that's a great point, Dan. So pre-COVID, part of what we would do for companies to test their resilience is a lot of physical phishing campaigns, meaning we would actually go on site and try and get physical access to their networks. And it is truly, truly frightening, the secure data centers that we made access to, not to mention a typical business. You show up with a box of pizzas or a box of donuts or some flowers or even a manila file that looks very official, and you're in a suit and tie, and most of the time they're going to let you in. And there's a lot of little tricks that our team uses on how to get from the reception area into the data center or into the network, where they can plug in a computer and put some fake malware on there to show that we did get access. but I had actually written a blog post a little over a year ago now. I think it was, can we hack your network with a polo shirt? If somebody has a polo shirt, XYZ Heating or something IT, and they walk into most businesses, they will be brought to wherever they ask to go without a lot of verification. So that's a really key point. Don't let that happen. Another thing that's included in the breach response service is the dark web scanning. So we want to see, are those credentials out there? What level of risk is that scan showing for your network? And this is an example that I ran on our own business to show you what that looks like. So I had run this at the beginning of February. It showed that there were 13 accounts potentially available through data breach, a total of 23 breaches. And the reason that those numbers don't exactly align is you'll often see the same credentials exposed in multiple breaches. Now, where it lists the accounts, this is where it shows how many breaches each account was in and the level of risk from low, high, and medium. And so what's important to know here, so you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, you're a security company. You know, how's this information out there on you? Well, this goes back to the point that if somebody collected emails from our staff through some other website, or let's say our insurance company, Blue Cross Blue Shield for our health insurance, and then they get breached, that's one of the ways this data gets out there on us, on you, on everybody. All of our data is out there somewhere. And so if it's been breached, this is what you'll see. Now, another critical thing to know here is, because we are a security company, we don't always use our regular email for some of the things that we do, especially if we know that the site might be at risk. And so a lot of the emails that you see here are not even valid emails. And so while it may show that the risk is high because the scanner doesn't know what's real and what's not, that's part of the information that we would walk through with you to be able to help you to understand, what does this really mean to me? But it's critical to know, because I've done these scans, again, go back to a law firm or a financial services organization, and they'll see that their managing partner's actual emails have been exposed in multiple breaches, and they know they never changed their passwords. That's a critical risk, versus something like this where Jeff at Foresite isn't even a real email. So it's been in 4 breaches, but who cares?
Right. Yeah, and I think this is the point here, was that, you know, these are emails that have been exposed. You don't know that the actual password is the same, but if people have a tendency to reuse passwords, that's when it becomes dangerous.
Right.
And actually,
so
these could be passwords for and so people can get into Office 365. Let's say they use their Office 365, then you know, it's not even your company network, it's your company email, and then people can use their email. If they're smart about it, they can escalate privileges, add people they're not even aware of, and be able to use your email account to send. You know, that's a great, you know, example of sending a spam to everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons that we felt strongly that we wanted to be able to offer that scan through Dan at no cost, because that's a good initial step. I know a lot of times we have these conversations, we do this type of presentation, and people start to worry, but they don't know how worried should they be, or what specifically should they be worried about. And so this gives us a way to help you see, with that initial step, are those credentials exposed? And if so, you know, Dan can talk you through, okay, are these real people? Are these people where they have Office 365? Do you have multi-factor authentication? We can ask those follow-up questions to help you determine what level of risk are you truly at based on the scan.
Right. You know, I don't think I mentioned, this is the report that we're offering everybody. So, you know, if you want to get a dark web scan, and this doesn't have any obligation, just give me a call, and we'll get that organized, and you can see the reports very quickly.
Great. And so now we're going to open the floor for some questions. I know a couple had popped up during the presentation, so if you do have a question, please go ahead and put it into the Q&A, and we'll get to that question as well. But the first one here was that somebody doesn't have cyber insurance, but they're wondering if $250,000 is enough coverage. The answer to that would be no, it is not enough coverage. Really, the breach response gap policy is meant to be exactly that. So you should have commercial cyber insurance based on the type of business, the type of data that you store and maintain. So if you have health data, for example, you're going to want a higher coverage limit, maybe 3 to 5 million, where if you don't have health data, you could go more in the $1 or $2 million range. But when you consider the cost of all of the various aspects, not just that initial investigation, but potential fines, if you do have to go to court, litigation costs, you might have to pay for notifications. There's a lot of different aspects to a full coverage policy. So really that $250,000 is just meant to help you pay your deductible and any initial forensics investigation. So make sure that you have coverage beyond that. Let's see. Okay, so Dan, this one is, my business has to comply with the cybersecurity maturity model certification for manufacturers. Should I still use the NIST framework that you suggested?
Well, there are numerous frameworks out there, but also the NIST is just a framework. It's really just, this is how the government says, or the National Institute of Standards and Technology says, yes, this is how you should approach it. But some companies are subject to actual regulation, and those can be different than the NIST. So if you have, like Tracy had mentioned, if you store data for clients in California, you're subject to CCPA, which is the California Privacy Act. So you need to know whether you're subject to those kind of regulations, or do financial business in New York. There's New York DFS, or you have health information. Everybody knows about HIPAA. So that's something that that we should talk about, what things are available, what regulations may apply to you, and we can also help you make sure that do things what we call risk assessments that can tell you whether you have any risk there, and what remediation, what steps you need to take to remediate that.
Yeah, it's also good to know that the NIST cybersecurity framework is the basis for a lot of the other, really all of the other US regulations. So if you're meeting the NIST framework, you're a good part of the way with CMMC or HIPAA or PCI. What those do is they just add some additional requirements based on the manufacturing sector or the healthcare sector or credit card processing, but the core of it all is going to be NIST. So that's really, ultimately, if you don't fall under something else, why we suggest aligning with that. Okay, here's one. How much does threat detection cost? We get that question a lot, and the answer is somewhat it depends, because it's going to depend on the assets that we're watching, that we're protecting. So we do have special pricing for small businesses. A typical small business might just have a firewall that we need to watch, or it might have a firewall, a couple of servers, 10 users that have Office 365 and endpoints that we want to watch all of those things. What I can tell you is that we're able to scale the services for small businesses. We actually developed our own proprietary solution because most of the solutions out there, Splunk is one that people might have heard of. They cost 6 figures to implement. They're really designed for enterprise. And the problem is that enterprise isn't the only one being targeted. So a typical SMB solution is going to be under $10,000 a year. You know, again, I'm caveating that with it depends on what you have to protect, but we have a lot of small businesses that we've been able to protect in the 10 to 15,000 range, giving them detection, giving them that response program, giving them training for their staff and the phishing emails. And so when you think about, even if you don't have protected data, if you go to a breach calculator, and there are many online, so you can verify this for yourself, if you had 1,000 records or 10,000 records, let's use 10,000, that's a good even number, and you didn't have protected data, the breach calculation comes out between $500,000 and $800,000 total cost per incident. And so a $10,000 or $15,000 a year investment to help minimize the risk of a $500,000 or $800,000 per incident cost is the way that you need to look at it. You don't get true return on investment per se, you get reduction of risk.
Yeah, and I think 2 points on that one. Some companies, they're like micro companies, are even small, in less than 10 or 15,000. But also that's the reason why we're also suggesting that you talk to your insurance provider to get full coverage, because the 250,000 is just not going to cover some of the bigger breaches, even the small breaches.
Definitely. And then the last question I see here, again, please submit one if you have one, is how do I know if my cyber insurance coverage has holes in it? That's another very good question. So first thing, this is recommended for everybody. Check your coverage to see what your notification requirements are, and make sure you know if you have to call that cyber insurer first before you call anybody else. But also find out, talk to your agent if it's not spelled out in your policy. If you have a breach, are they going to provide forensics resources? If not, make sure whether you put this coverage in place or you go to somebody else, that's fine, but make sure you've got somebody that you can call 24/7 should you need them. But also look for that language I talked about: failure to maintain, reasonable precautions, or anything that definitively says that you are meeting compliance or privacy requirements as a blanket statement. Those are all things that you want to be very, very careful of if you're looking through your insurance policies.
Okay.
Wow, this was some great information. I have a question. Is there like some domino effect, either forward or backward, that goes from like a consumer does business with a business, and then that business does business with other businesses? Like, is that a whole crazy mess there?
Definitely. Well, in some cases, it's what we were talking about with the dark web scan. You don't even know your data's out there because it's been breached through some other breach. But also there's a lot of targeting now of IT providers or accountants or web developers. Anybody who it's reasonable to expect might have connection into their customers' networks. And so if they can gain access to that business, they can potentially gain access to all of their clients at the same time, or all of their clients' data at the same time. And so that's a really critical thing. That's why we're talking about check your vendors, anybody who either has access to the data you're responsible for or directly access into your network. You need to make sure they're aware of the cybersecurity precautions that they should reasonably be taking. And ideally, you want to get them to give you something on paper stating that they are doing that, so that if worst case scenario happens and you have to have a breach claim and all the related expenses, you at least have a chance of being able to go after them, and hopefully they also have some coverage.
Great. So no matter the size of the business, you need some help. Like, you need somebody should be helping you on that IT end of things. You shouldn't be doing that, trying to do that on your own. And through you, through other chamber members, we have resources for every size of business. Correct?
That's correct.
Good. Good. Awesome. Well, thank you so much to our viewers for joining us today. And thank you, Dan and Tracy, for all this. I was going to say valuable information, which it truly is. A little scary, but we rest assured that we have people that are able to help us all through these little steps in all that. So to our viewers, look for this recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel. It will be uploaded within the week, so you'll be able to go back and review it. I encourage you to reach out and ask any questions. Our next Tips from the Experts webinar will be next Wednesday, March 10th at 10 a.m. And we'll be talking about tips for writing effective professional emails. So we're all sending a lot more emails these days, and we want to make sure that we're getting the results we want from that. So you can find complete details and registration on our website. And you'll also find any additional upcoming on our calendar event as well. So as your member engagement specialist here at the Chamber, feel free to reach out to me anytime. I can assist you or anyone in your company to make the most of your Chamber membership, to help guide you through that or make connections. And I wish you a productive rest of your day.
All right. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Tracy.
Thank you. Bye.